Okay, we'll just talk briefly about trauma in teenagers and what we might see. First of all, to give you more information about what happens or what's most likely to happen, self-report data indicate that sexual victimization, especially in girls, and physical assault are the most likely types of trauma to occur. And in another study, they found that traumatic loss or separation, bereavement, and emotional abuse were the most commonly seen types of trauma, with girls being more likely to experience emotional abuse. And we also see another common traumatic event that occurs is an impaired caregiver. So that might be due to some mental health challenges. It might be due to substance abuse issues or other things. And close to half of teens who were part of this study in 2015 experienced more than one traumatic event. And this was a large nationwide study. So we know that all environments that kids and teens are exposed to produce changes in the brain because our brains are sensitive to social interactions. So a teen's environment impacts their development, and then it also provides opportunities to flourish or potentially put them at risk because of what's happening in the brain. We do know that the brain is possible to change throughout one's life, but early childhood and adolescence are two really key times for potential change because those are times when the brain is very moldable, and it takes longer to change a brain in adulthood. It would be a lot easier to do it right the first time, if possible. So what we see with stress is that with a supportive caregiver, a teen can have a positive adaptation to mild, moderate, or really strong stress even. A new school year can create some stress for teenagers. And with support, of course, that experience is very growth promoting. And toxic stress will occur when a teen is experiencing very high levels of stress in an ongoing basis without an adult caregiver there to buffer that stress for them. And some of that happens when maybe the caregiver is the source of the stress or the trauma. And when this is ongoing, neurons and their connections in the brain might die, which can result in a smaller brain, and that myelin sheath, that fatty sheath that makes the messages in the brain travel faster and be more effective. It can, just that growth of the fatty sheath can be disrupted as well with trauma during the teenage years. And those impacts can be seen in the hippocampus when there's toxic stress, as well as high levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone in the brain. Memory can be impacted, as can mood, because of that damage that can happen to the hippocampus. And then that teen's ability to discriminate between safe and dangerous situations might be impacted. So a little more about the impact of trauma on the brain. It can impact a person's ability to cope with stress, which can lead to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, asthma, diabetes, and even inflammatory response, the body's ability to respond to inflammation. And the amygdala, which is that fear center in the brain, which is located on the inside, here in this kind of middle or central lower part of the brain, it can become overactive. And then, usually the prefrontal cortex, that frontal area of the brain where so much of our decision making, planning, ability to focus is housed, it tends to kind of influence many of the different parts of the brain once it comes online, being connected more, which, during the teenage years, that's a prime time for integration of those different fibers. And when there is trauma during the teen years, then the amygdala may actually become a little bit more powerful than the prefrontal cortex, which can then decrease a person's ability to plan, focus, pay attention, make good decisions. And then because of the damage that also occurs to the hippocampus, then person's memory might be impacted and their mood could be impacted as well. And usually that prefrontal cortex regulates our impulses and moods through controlling the amygdala, and that helps the teenager make decisions. But especially for teens who have experienced a lot of trauma in childhood or who are in their teenage years, then that prefrontal cortex might develop in a way so that the teenager is always prepared for threat and danger. And that makes it so that they're less able to control their moods, their impulses, and less likely to make thoughtful decisions or to plan well. We know that behaviors are symptoms of what's happening in the brain, and things that we might see happening in teenagers when there is ongoing trauma in particular. And we might see developmental delays, or the teenager maybe regressing back to earlier behaviors again, things that again were no longer issues. We might see those become an issue again. We might see a teenager get stuck in wherever that trauma, whatever age that trauma began happening, and not really making a lot of developmental progress. We might see teens who keep reliving, playing that traumatic event over and over in their head. They might have a hard time sleeping. They might have nightmares. We might see eating issues or even eating disorders surface here. And lots of times we might see them complain about headaches, stomach aches, just not being well physically. And sometimes we'll see big changes in their behavior, where they just might start going wild. They might just become really moody. And this is hard to tell sometimes, because just with the fluctuation of hormones in the brain during teenage years anyway, teens can be more moody already. We might see an inability to concentrate or have memory issues, a lack of eye contact, that irritability, reactivity, anxiety, depression, worry about their safety, psychological distress, personality changes, maybe changes in their relationships with their friends as well, and increased focus within. So they might begin to withdraw a little bit more. They may not seek or accept comforting from those who have always been there for them. And then we often see a loss of self-confidence and self-esteem, and they might distance themselves from caregivers or friends. And this is really hard, because all of these things could be signs of just regular, normal adolescence, right? So it's hard. Some other things that we might see are that, they might have detailed, long-term, and very sensory-focused memory for that traumatic event. And sometimes they have just a fragmented memory. We might see more truancy or substance use or abuse, beginning to hurt animals, becoming more aggressive, violent, risk-taking, maybe having reckless behaviors. We sometimes see suicidal ideation or cutting and self-harm. Some a great desire to escape shame, guilt, humiliation. And sometimes we see them engaging in adult behaviors like, becoming sexually active, dropping out of school, deciding they're going to get married. They might get pregnant. They might have flashbacks, becoming more accident prone, wanting to get away from their feelings of shame, guilt, humiliation, very aware of their parents and wanting to protect them from their own distress as well. Teens who have experienced child sexual abuse are more likely to experience dating violence in their early dating relationships. And among females, students who have experienced child sexual abuse are up to 5 times more at risk of sexual assault in adulthood as well. So although it can be really hard, trauma is something that we should probably talk about with our teens so that they don't end up having more trauma down the road in their lives, or at least, they might be less likely to have more trauma down the road in their lives. And we see that for both kids and teenagers, when they have experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, and witnessing domestic violence, those are more significantly related to post traumatic stress disorder than accidents, natural disasters, or witnessing or being a victim of a crime. And that is believed to be because it's relational abuse. It's from somebody typically who they are very intimately involved with, as very often a family member, like a parent, and having something happen that's not supposed to happen can be particularly damaging for their brains. And some of the additional teen responses by gender, both boys and girls experience anger and dissociation after trauma, and girls also experience more depression and anxiety. Boys are more impacted by being a victim than witnessing trauma, and girls have similar responses regardless of whether they witnessed or experienced a traumatic event. And then, of course, girls are focused on relationships and they might begin to use substances and experience mental health issues after trauma, particularly with people that they're very close to. And boys will very often show externalizing behaviors after trauma has occurred, but they may also deny that there was any sort of trauma that has occurred.